welcome to our first ever Scottish Universities Press Fireside, which marks the launch of our first book title, Conversations with Tim Ingold. We're delighted to have so many registrations for this event and to welcome colleagues from different locations and from a variety of backgrounds with interests in anthropology, libraries, open access and more. It's truly a great way to start a conversation. Scottish Universities Press, or SUP as you may hear us abbreviate it, is a fully open access and not-for-profit press which has been developed by 19 university libraries working together through SCURL, which is the Scottish Confederation of University and Research Libraries. We're so pleased to be holding this launch event during International Open Access Week, as we see SUP as a shining example of this year's theme, which is community over commercialisation. We're also grateful to the authors for choosing SUP as their publisher and trusting us to support their research in this way, and for finding time to take part in today's discussion. Let me do some brief introductions before we get started. Tim Ingold is a Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. His work has ranged from human-environmental relations in the circumpolar north, through evolutionary theory, perception and skilled practice to art, architecture and design. Tim is a fellow of both the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and in 2022 he was made a CBE for services to anthropology. We also have Robert Gibb, who teaches anthropology and sociology at the University of Glasgow. Philip Tonner is an anthropologist who works mainly at the intersection of philosophy and archaeology. He's based in the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. And Diego Maria Malara is a senior lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Glasgow, working on religion and politics in Ethiopia. I should also introduce myself. I'm Hannah Whaley. I'm the University Librarian and Director of Library, Academic and Cultural Services at the University of Dundee. I'm also Founding Director and Chair of the SUP Management Board. I'm joined by my colleague Gillian Daly, who's Executive Officer of SCURL and Press Manager for SUP. Now, the format for today is one of discussion, so let me outline a little of that as a way of ending this introductory preamble and moving us into those conversations. Please do feel free to submit questions and type your questions to the Q&A section. Julian and I will start by asking some questions of the panel about the book and its journey to publication, which gives you a little bit more time to get your questions in. And then we'll look to open up to questions both submitted during the registration and moving through the Q&A over the course of the event. You're very welcome to ask questions, and I'll aim to keep things moving along so that we can get through as many as possible. There's a chat function which will be available throughout the event for informal exchanges or to alert us as hosts to any issues, but please use the Q&A to submit questions to the panel. So without further ado, I'll pass the honour of the first question over to Gillian.
Thank you, Hannah. So as Hannah mentioned, we are very much in the thick of International Open Access Week, and we're launching an open access press. So that seems to suggest a kind of natural starting point for discussions. In reading the book, in conversation 2, Tim talks about demolishing the walls that divide the land of academia from the rest of the world. And I have to say that on reading that, I really felt like that could be a description for the overarching aim of open access publishing too. So I wonder if you can begin just by telling us a bit about your decision to publish open access.
Well, I actually started off as an open access skeptic. When the whole open access thing started, it seemed to me to be a big ruse, a big deceit by which the big publishing corporations, things like Taylor and Francis, Wiley, Elsevier, Springer, were basically holding the academic world to ransom while making mega bucks for themselves. I thought it was a trap, and that gullible academics had sort of fired by noble ideals about making knowledge available to everybody, had walked right into it. But then it seemed to me that these big corporations are actually strangling genuine scholarship. They're the kind of the output end of a massive knowledge production industry. And with this kind of input-output thing, well, what comes out is basically shit. And so what's the point of having open access if what's coming out at the other end is garbage? But then it seemed to me that the real issue actually is not about open access itself. It's about how to break the monopoly power of these big publishing corporations. That, I think, is the real issue. And it seems to me, although I don't quite understand the mechanics of it all, that small university presses like SUP and there's a few other small independent publishers that are doing open access, like Punctum, for example, they could subvert the business model of the big corporations by playing them at their own game. And I think that's the way forward. So I'm really interested in open access because as a way of giving more strength to the bow of small university presses and breaking down the power of these enormous corporations that have literally strangled academic scholarship.
Thank you, Tim. I think so much of that chimes with our experience in libraries, kind of long-standing issues of dealing with some of the conditions attached by publishers. So that's really interesting to hear. Thinking then about why open access, but why specifically SUP? Does anyone want to pick up on that?
Thank you. I'll take that one. When I saw the email announcing the launch of the Scottish University Press, I was immediately intrigued. And after looking at the website more carefully, I contacted Robert and Philip to ask what they thought. We had been searching for publishers, and we'd already discussed how, given Tim's cross-disciplinary impact and relevance of his work to so many timely public debates, we wanted the book to be published as open access. But there were several reasons why we eventually decided on SUP. For me, one of the most compelling was that SUP operates on a specific not-for-profit model and reinvests surpluses into the press. I also hold our colleague at the Library of the University of Glasgow in extremely high regard. They're doing a truly terrific job year after year, often under very challenging conditions. And the fact that SUP was a libraries-led initiative run by people that I know are so dedicated to the public circulation of knowledge rather than top-down commercial enterprises played a key role in our decision, I guess. Finally, there is something that Tim mentioned in the book that made me reflect more deeply about Glasgow and Scotland, the places where I live and work. Tim told us that some of his colleagues viewed Aberdeen and its university as peripheral academic sites due to their geography. However, Tim argues that far from being academically remote and isolated, Aberdeen was central to a network of institutions across Northern Europe and beyond. Now, the context of my answer to your question obviously is rather different, of course, but I also often hear similar arguments about Scotland being somewhat academically peripheral, and that's a view that personally I found profoundly unconvincing. So maybe in some sense, working with a Scottish network like SUP also felt like an attractive and exciting way to challenge the tropes of remoteness which are central to these discourses.
Thank you. I mean, so much of that is what we hoped in setting up the press, but that perspective about the geographical situation is really interesting and maybe not something that we had thought through. So really great to hear that. And yeah, thanks again for choosing to work with us as well. Although, it's great to hear your kind of feedback and your background and all of this, but we know that there are still people out there who are reticent about open access, and there are still quite a lot of misconceptions around there about what it means to publish open access. Do you have any advice or suggestions and tips for colleagues who might be considering this publishing option?
Okay. This is a much more complex question, and I certainly don't consider myself an expert on the technical aspects of open access or securing fundings for it, and thankfully you are here. So if there is any question from the audience about these aspects, you can give a more sound answer. Now, without really wanting to sound polemical or patronizing, I would say that perhaps I would encourage colleagues to read widely about open access and to reflect critically on how even this seemingly benign model might, just like Tim was saying, in some cases, reinforce our discipline's dependence on a handful of large commercial publishers. On the other hand, there are open access initiatives that prioritize sustainability and fairness, and I think that these deserve more thoughtful consideration by authors and should be actively supported in any way possible. I guess, another important aspect to consider is the kind of audience that we want to reach when we get an open access book out in the world. It is, of course, one thing to publish work, but it's another thing entirely to ensure that the general public, beyond the narrow academic community, is even aware of the work's existence and can engage with it if it's of interest to them. And of course, and here I'm sure I speak also for Philip and Robert, Tim's work is likely to appeal to a wide audience beyond academia. So we've had a very important discussion with the SUP about organizing meetings and workshops in public libraries to promote the book and facilitate conversations with extra academic audiences, which are probably conversations that are different from the kind of academic debates we're accustomed to. Now, I might be wrong here, but this is an aspect of open access particularly important in the hyper-commercialized academic landscape we see in the UK, where the divide between universities and the communities around them often feels so entrenched and so discouraging. So if our aim is to engage with broader publics, maybe we can think about open access less as an end in itself and more as a part of a broader ecology of dissemination, so to speak.
Thanks, Diego. I think a lot of what you're saying there will definitely chime with colleagues working within open access and within libraries, where that sense of community and how to reach people has long been of interest. That support for the OA model and exploring these different aspects is really important. I'm keen that we also move to discuss the book so that we can give the audience a sense of the work and the writing as well. And I wonder if I could quite simply ask, where did the idea for the book come from?
So just to comment on that, I think there are lots of good reasons to write about Tim and with Tim and about Tim's work. But from my perspective, I started to become more interested in how to move within philosophy and move out with philosophy into areas like archaeology and so on. And what I found in Tim was just the right kind of balance of anthropology, philosophy, archaeology, and evolutionary questions that really made his work, an essential thing to engage with. So Tim himself was very encouraging to me in communications and support for my own work. And when I came to Glasgow and discovered the Anthropology network that Diego and colleagues had organised, they were going to be interviewing Tim, so I volunteered to take part. We conducted the interview during, I think, just right at the start of lockdown, and engaging with Tim in that process and having a wider engagement with his writings really convinced me that working on an introduction to Tim, as I'd started to do, would be better served collaboratively. So after that interview in the Anthropology network, it seemed a natural step for me to ask Robert and Diego if they would be interested in asking Tim if he would be willing to participate in a further series of interviews with a view to turning that into a book, something along the lines of an introduction to his thought, to his life and work. So that was really my kind of take on that.
And that interview format that you mentioned, you followed that through in the book. People will have seen both the clue in the title, that it's conversations, and anyone that's delved in on its release now will be seeing that as well. So why that sort of sticking with that interview format, and what did that bring to the writing of the book?
Well, in response to the opening question of the very first conversation, Tim explains that sometimes being interviewed has helped him clarify his own thinking. And Philip, Diego, and I thought at the outset that an interview or a series of interviews could be extremely useful to readers too, in helping to learn more about a particular scholar and their work. So we felt that the question and answer format was be an engaging and accessible presentation of key arguments and ideas. And we'll look forward to getting feedback maybe today or afterwards from readers of the book, or whether that's been the case for them.
Yes, I think so, and I think it will be interesting for you to get that feedback. Was there any challenges with that interview format? Tim, in the book you mentioned cautioning students against approaches to research. I mean, you've got large scale sort of transcription exercises. Imagine transcription might well have been one challenge, but were there others, either from the interviewee or interviewer perspective?
Tim, you're on mute. Sorry.
Excuse me. Yeah. So sorry, I'll start again. That as Robert said, the interview format was very, very helpful for me in clarifying actually what I thought about various things. It was challenging in the sense that usually if I'm writing something, I'm asking my own questions and I'm setting my own agenda and responding to that. And in an interview format, you're actually responding to somebody else's agenda, which is a challenge, because you're having to reformulate things in such a way as to press different buttons, if you like. But I've always emphasized in my own work the importance of conversation as a basic democratic procedure of scholarship. And so the fact that this book is called Conversations is itself very important to me. I did find it challenging having all the time to think on my feet. And you know how it is that in an interview, when you're thinking on your feet, and then an hour or two afterwards, you think of what you really ought to have said or meant to say, or words you should have used, and then you're annoyed because you didn't say it then. But that did mean that there was actually a lot of work in dealing with the transcripts afterwards. I confess to having rewritten quite a lot of the direct transcripts in order to turn what looked to be a rather chaotic text, even though it had been beautifully edited as much as by Robert and Diego and Philip as they could. I still needed a lot of work to turn it into something that looked coherent. So that was the challenge afterwards. I don't know if Philip, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just I think that that was actually part of the fun was you know, if you can speak about transcription, it's fun, but that certainly was the perspective into the thinking process that Tim uses, you know, that Tim you know, a perspective in Tim's thought, and to see how he does it live, as it were, during the interviews. And one of the challenges, though, I think that from our perspective was probably to keep ourselves and our questions and the conversation then to some kind of manageable level. I think one of the first interviews that we did went well over 2 hours, and we could probably have done that for each of the interviews, but we, I think, kind of pulled ourselves back a little bit from that and tried to turn it into something that was more confined and more manageable, not only in terms of not impinging too much on Tim's time, but also in terms of thinking about, well, how are we then going to work with this material? So that was a challenge.
Yes, no, absolutely. That's really interesting to hear. I like the idea of writing as thinking, but the idea of clarifying thoughts through conversation as well. I wonder if any of the questions took you somewhere unexpected, Tim.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I was prepared in the sense that Robert and Philip and Diego very kindly provided me with a sort of agenda in advance for each session. So I knew pretty much what was going to come up and I could be prepared for it. But in some ways I surprised myself in perhaps two things. I mean, one was that there's a lot of discussion about politics. And politics is something that people are often saying there's no politics in my work. My argument against that is that the politics actually lies in the writing. But there was quite an extended discussion of this whole political issue about what the politics of writing is and where the politics is in what I've written, which probably took me a little bit outside my comfort zone and was very useful in that way. I think the other thing that took me by surprise, for which I think I owe Philip, is theology. I would never have imagined when I set out on my academic career growing up in a thoroughly atheistic household, and with no religious affiliation whatever, that I would find myself eventually moving towards questions that begin to engage with such issues as God and things of this kind. And that somehow surfaced in one or two times during the conversations in ways that took me by surprise in a very positive way.
It's really great to hear how you've challenged yourselves in both the work and also in the thinking as well, as you're stepping through that. Gillian, have you?
Yeah, can I just ask a final?
Yeah,
sorry, Hannah. Can I just ask a final question before we open more widely? And just going back to that theme of the aims of open access in terms of extending out to wider audiences. And I'm just wondering if you had any specific thoughts about what a general reader or a more general audience might take from the book.
That's such a great question. It's also a very difficult question to answer because Tim's work is very diverse and relevant to so many public and urgent debates. Now, I was reflecting on this a few days ago when I had a conversation with my neighbor, who is a retired journalist from the islands, who emphasized how lines, paths, traces, which are key topics, of course, in Tim's work, are central to how people in his region think about movement, land, but also belonging. And he immediately found a focus of online resonant with his experience. It made complete sense to him. And in fact, he said, well, why is anthropology not about that? Why weren't these topics not explored before? But it also, for him, resonated with broader histories of dispossession, and particularly the so-called enclosures, which consolidated, as the Scots will know, private properties and privileged wealthy landowners at the expenses of communal land and family-operated farms. It strikes me that every enclosure perhaps starts with a line, a violent demarcation, and how painfully timely this topic is in today's world. So I think that Tim's work can contribute a lot in that sense, and I must confess I hadn't seen that interest coming, and I'm happy that the neighbor is buying the book. But now a compelling aspect of Tim's work for me that will appeal to many people is his critique of the stubborn ways in which we understand the relationship between humans and nature through tired dichotomic separations. As you can imagine, when you're working with young students, you constantly hear concerns about the climate crisis, for instance, accompanied by a growing sense of urgency to creatively rethink the significance of our positioning within the environment, right? As humans, as individuals, and so on. What is really interesting is that these concerns also overlap with Tim's more recent work on generations, where, to simplify a quite complex argument, he argues against viewing succeeding generation as self-contained social entities stuck upon one another in a lasagna shape, as it were. So Tim's highlight instead how generations are inextricably entwined, wrapping around one another in time. And to me, this perspective will appeal to many because I think it really manages to capture both frictions and continuities between generations in a time of crisis, which concretize the energies beyond current activism, as well as the very substance of our nightmares of collective finitude, so to speak. So generations here are not just one means through which we rework imaginaries of the futures, but they also perhaps provide the tools to contemplate his tragic disappearance from the imaginative horizon. And I'm absolutely convinced that the unorthodox conversation format of the book allows for a more informal and accessible prose and discussion about topics and arguments which are very, very difficult, very intricate, making the book more digestible for a general public. But maybe we can also say that in a sense, this book is a very bold vindication of anthropologists' enduring relevance in addressing pressing global challenges. And I'm absolutely sure that this will be a book that young people might be interested in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And in terms of, speaking myself as a non-anthropologist and having read the book, I felt that the conversational approach really did open up the topics covered, and the sheer breadth, I think, would definitely mean that, anybody could take something from that. And going back to your neighbour's point, actually, I probably quite a similar experience. Reading the chapter on the conversations on lines, I was kind of absorbing all that, and then I was in a cafe when I was reading it, and I looked around and I realised that I was sitting on a carpet that was totally lined, and I was kind of at the centre of this, and I was reading the bit about the South Indian communities who believe that is a filtering system. They put lined fabric on the doors as a filtering system against various kind of ills and evils. So I had this lovely moment of kind of synchronicity, I suppose, of reading that and feeling at the centre of a bunch of lines myself, which was a really nice moment. But I will end there on that probably oversharing episode, and open up more widely to some of the questions that we've had as part of registration.
Gillian, I'll pick up there. Just say no. I'm glad you shared that, because I'm excited for the authors to be hearing this feedback. I think they're going to get from the book and from this format that you've written it in, and the way that will let people sort of access these conversations and your thinking and step into it themselves. So I think that's a great example, and so I'm actually quite excited to hear more of that about the book from your readers now that we're launched. I'm going to just mention to everybody as a reminder that this is a question and answer format that everybody is really welcome to participate in. So for everybody in the audience, please use the Q&A section to submit your questions, and we'll keep stepping through questions that people are submitting. So do put them in there, get your question in now, so that we will be moving on to those in just a moment. As people are doing that, then let me ask one that's coming from people as they registered. The first question I'll go with is from Yeroen Herk at Scotland's Rural College Student Association, who asks, governments encourage tertiary education institutions to promote entrepreneurialism, supporting individuals and business rather than people or communities. How can we teach students to demand economic democracy where the means of production are shared?
Do you want me to ask that? It's a hard question to answer. Maybe I'll defer to my colleagues.
I'll leave it to yourselves to choose who wants to answer for a second, or I can pick.
Well, maybe I could say something there. Just that in the book, Tim talks about the campaign that he was involved with at Aberdeen University on reclaiming our university, and I think that for me was a very interesting example, which I didn't know much about before the interview, of trying to do the kind of thing, or provide a kind of alternative that the questioner is pointing to in the question. I don't know whether you want to say more about that, Tim, or something else, but that's my immediate response.
I could say a wee bit about it. It was a movement which was not just against the corporatization of the university that was going on at that time, but actually to, in a more positive sense, to try and create a model of what a university of the future should be like. I mean, the problem is in academia that we all know that there's things are going wrong with universities, and we all know what the reasons are. It's much more difficult to argue for an alternative conception of what the university of the future should be, and that was what that movement was about. And we figured that the university of the future rests on four basic pillars, which are freedom, trust, education, and community. And we spend a lot of time debating the precise meanings of those terms. And I think that's the kind of work that really needs to be done at a fundamental level. And I do think that there is a possibility to renew our universities and reform them. I don't think we should just abolish them or let them die out. But that the work has to be done, as it were, from the bottom up. We can't expect people in power to do it for us. We, that is, staff, students, people working at the coalface, have to sit down and think these issues through for ourselves, and then try to realize them.
Thanks, Tim. Does anyone else want to add, or shall we move on to the next question? Yeah. So the next one we have is from Jennifer Loudon, who is the Vice Chair of our SUP Management Board and Director of the Library at Robert Gordon University. And Jennifer's asking, if you could choose only one, would you prefer the book to be a commercial success or a critical success?
I like these questions in the paper that ask you whether you want more sex, pay more money. I think critical success is what I'm concerned with. Maybe commercial success is what you at SUP are concerned with.
Can I add just a note? I think we all agree with Tim. And if I'm not mistaken, we all chose to redirect our share of the profits into the press, precisely because, you know, that's really was our concern.
So I think that's an excellent question, and we appreciate the answer there. And I think I'll reiterate the theme of International Open Access Week being community over commercialization. And I think that idea of supporting authors to see the impact that they want with their research and their work, and finding that community is certainly an interesting direction for all of us to keep headed in. So yeah, absolutely appreciate your answers there. I have one further question from registration ones, which was Sian Guo from University of Chicago, asking if you could expand a little further on the evolution without inheritance article.
Oh, that's a long, complicated one, but this is. I've been long having arguments with those who have been putting forward a neo-Darwinian perspective in evolutionary biology and trying to incorporate the phenomena of what we call culture within that perspective. And what I try to do there is to show that despite various attempts to broaden the neo-Darwinian paradigm into what is sometimes called the extended evolutionary synthesis, which includes various kinds of inheritance of modalities beyond the genetic, that the real bug in the system, the real flaw is the concept of inheritance itself, which most evolutionary biologists take as a kind of sine qua non of evolution. They say, how can you possibly have evolution unless there is inheritance? And it somehow goes back to what Diego was talking about earlier in relation to the idea of generations. If we think about generations not as replacing one another sequentially in layers, but as winding around one another, the image I use is of fibers in a rope, that they twist around one another, and as old fibers give out, you introduce new ones so the rope can keep on winding. And if you think of life like that, as a process in which generations work together in keeping the process going, then the idea of inheritance, of passing on a package of genes or culture or whatever it might be from one generation to the next, really doesn't make sense. So what I try to do in that article is to see how we could think of evolution as a life process that does not just take place within generations, but goes across generations through the overlap of successive life cycles. That's a quick summary. It's a long article and it's quite complex.
Thanks, Tim. No, I appreciate that, and I hope that that's given Sian some more information there. But again, so much more to unpack and explore in all of your work. Shall we move on to other questions that are coming in, Gillian?
Yeah, so we have a few questions coming through the chat now. The first is, I'm a newbie in anthropology, so please forgive the basic question. Since ethnography is a research method now used widely across disciplines, what makes a particular ethnography anthropological and others not?
I've had a long argument about the relationship between anthropology and ethnography, which continues to be controversial both within anthropology and without. My view actually is that although anthropology and ethnography are both valid exercises, they have different objectives. And that whilst ethnography is an attempt to understand the life and time and thinking of people somewhere, sometime, in its context, subtly, with sensitivity. That is one thing. But the goal of anthropology is to inquire through conversations with people into the conditions and possibilities of human life in the world. It's to address the question, how should we live, through conversations with others? And that's a different objective. And I've been trying to show how we need to, we should not confuse these two. And part of that is to argue again that we should not actually think of ethnography as a research method at all. The method we use is participant observation, and that is observing people or observing what is going on. Observing means not objectifying, but of following, watching, paying attention to what is going on around us through our participation in the life in which we're interested. So participant observation is a kind of conversation, if you will. And it's through conversations that we mutually develop understandings which are potentially transformative. I think it's somehow misleading to render that process as ethnography, and particularly misleading to think of ethnography as a method, a means to collect data for some further end. Ethnography is not a means to an end; it's an end in itself. And so I'm a bit critical of the way in which ethnography has been exported from anthropology to all sorts of other subjects as this kind of method you can use, which is sometimes simply equated with collecting information that is qualitative rather than quantitative. And that really reduces it. It makes it almost banal, and I think is something we have to question and resist.
Thanks so much for that summary, Tim. And I know that there's much more discussion on that in the book. So this is a good opportunity just to plug that is available free to download from sup.ac.uk for that further exploration of that topic. And over to Hannah for the next question.
Thanks. And we've got a question from Emmanuel Fantini asking, did you think of a podcast as a medium to share the interviews, or perhaps as a companion to the book?
If you don't mind, I'll take that one. First of all, hi, Emanuele. Emanuele is a colleague working at the Delphi Institute for Water Education, Water Conflicts and Rights to Water, which I think are very relevant to this kind of conversations we had. Interestingly, the book started as a sort of podcast, as a extended conversation about Tim's work and his research development, which was recorded and uploaded on the YouTube channel of the Glasgow Anthropology Network. And we did think about different ways of disseminating and expanding these conversations. But ultimately, to be entirely honest with you, we thought it was quite complicated, so we went for the book option. And perhaps in the future, we'll manage to put together some more multimedia tools that will allow us to further communicate these ideas.
Thanks, Diego. Gillian?
Yeah, so the next one is, I'm not sure, this is maybe a bigger, wider life question, really. Tim, you had mentioned that when you're in an interview situation that you often you reflect back and think what you should have said or what you would have liked to have said. Does anyone have any tips for combating this occurrence? Certainly, I don't know, I think that's one of these things, behaviour patterns that we're doomed to repeat. But any ideas, welcome?
I don't think it's something to combat. I think it's something to celebrate, because what it shows is that you're thinking. You say something in a conversation with somebody, and then it's still going around your head after the conversation is finished, because things don't stop. Your mind is in a whirl, and then sometime later you said, it's as though you come to the next thing. So. And then you say, oh, I wish I'd said that. But what you mean really is that your thinking doesn't suddenly stop at the moment when the interview comes to an end or the conversation stops. It carries on, and it's precisely because it's carrying on that it's being productive. You think you're actually getting somewhere. So far from thinking this is something I've got to combat, you say rather you should welcome this because it shows that you're moving on, and that thought is alive and moving.
I think that's a great way to look at it, and certainly, reassuring for all of us who are in that situation. I did wonder if I may just jump in with another question. Did that make it difficult in terms of editing the book? If you're always going back thinking, your mind's racing on and you're, thinking that you've got more to contribute, more to add, was it hard just to draw a final line for that reason?
It is a little hard, but the thing about this book and what for me makes it special is precisely that through the conversation format, it allows us to see what's really going on when minds are at work. See, when students read academic texts, what they usually get is a set of fine-tuned arguments, authoritative propositions, like this is how it is, the author explaining whatever it is that they've come up with. And you don't realize that actually behind all this is a mind that is kind of racked by foibles, doubts, anxieties. We tend to cover all that up when we publish our authoritative works, so that nobody can see all the anxiety, all the doubts, all the contradictions, all that are trying to work themselves out. And what I like about this book is that it might be actually rather full of these things, but it gives us a glimpse into what the working of scholarship really is behind the scenes of the finely crafted authoritative works that we tend to put out for publication. And that's, I think, is what's special about it.
Absolutely, and I think that goes back to the point about the breadth of appeal. I think there's an honesty in that will attract different audiences as well. So thank you, Tim, and over to Hannah for the next one.
Yes, thank you. No, I appreciate that conversation. That idea of insight into what is creative process as well as research process, I think is saying lots that people can learn and will want to take from that or find interest in. There's a question about SUP's not-for-profit funding model. So how does the money work with open access? How does that flow? And I wonder if Gillian might want to take that one.
Yeah, and had not expected to be on this end of the questions, but certainly happy to do so. So our funding model, SUP, is funded by the libraries who manage it. So they contribute a subscription which covers our operating costs, and we then, for book production, do charge the production costs for each of the books that we publish. So that covers our costs, but we are not out to make any additional profit. Any surpluses that emerge from our activity will be, as the authors have said, reinvested in the press. We have just set up, so we don't have an established process for that yet, but our intention and our aim is to use those surpluses to overcome the barriers for those who might struggle to meet the BPC, and then to make the processing charge who wouldn't be able to pay to publish their books, and thereby make it even more open again. And again, just please do visit the website where there's some great content on there, just outlining that in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Gillian. And a question from Aileen McClone, thinking more on that topic as its book is the beginning of a new open publishing infrastructure. Can the panel share any thoughts on what you think the knock-on effects might be of this openness, or what we would like them to be? Any worries for the future, such as protection measures from scraping for AI?
Does it help if I kick off on that one again? Is that okay? Yeah, and maybe bring in. So
my depths with it.
Well, actually, I was just going to go back to your opening statement, Tim, and all of the kind of issues that you outlined in terms of, the publishing landscape and relationship with publishers. So what I would hope is that we in future have a fairer and more equitable publishing infrastructure. And I think that all of the university publishing, all of the presses that are emerging in the last number of years are moving towards that. So to diversity in what is quite a really closed environment where, you know, monopolies exist across some of the really big publishers. So I think that having that fairer and more open infrastructure will have real benefits, both in terms of how publishing operates within institutions, but in terms of how that the money stacks up. You know, in libraries we're often you know, left with the really high costs of closed content. So I think that we're really keenly aware that of the benefits that open access can bring in that area. On the question of worries about the future, yeah, I mean, I think that the scraping through AI is a reality that we faced quite early on. So we had, when we set up SUP, we wanted all of our content to be openly, as open for reuse as possible. But we were advised by colleagues that, you know, even content on our website available for free was being scraped and resold on third-party sites. So we had to think about our licensing really early on in terms of protecting authors against that. And I think that will be an ongoing challenge in so many different reuses of content, and quite unscrupulous approaches are emerging. So it's something that is a concern. But again, I think that having the kind of trusted infrastructure through libraries is a really important balancing effect to some of the threats and challenges from AI. I don't know if any of the panel want to come in on any of that.
I might just add to it that I think that the AI is a bubble that will soon burst. I don't think it has any future. I'm pretty sure, in fact, that most of the digital thing will probably not last more than another century. In the long term, I think it's probably not a worry. It's simply unsustainable. So anyway, that's my view of it.
No, that's a great view to contribute in, and I think a final word I would add to that question is just that libraries' interests align with all of these things. We're interested in access, in long-term preservation and sustainability. We're interested in technology as means to support people, but also in licensing and making sure that authors and our researchers are achieving what they need to do within that. So all of these things, we feel the libraries have a place to be in that conversation. So we're glad that this gives a mechanism to participate in that. Gillian, do you want to pick a question? Given you've been on the
Yes, so we have a question from Richard Irving coming in on the Q&A. What do the authors think about the future of the dialogue disputation as a literary format? It was very popular in the Renaissance and got Galileo in some hot water back then, but seems to have waned in popularity. Are you spearheading a comeback?
I don't know, but I like it. I like it as a format. When it's done the way it was done in this case, I've noticed quite often now in journals, we often have little bits at the end where there's some conversation going on or a little interview thing. And sometimes I find them a bit irritating because it sounds cliquish. It's a group, maybe people who know and admire one another, and they spend a lot of pages patting each other on the back and explaining how clever they are, and that's annoying. I didn't have that experience with Diego, Robert, and Philip. Quite contrary, and I think so. Disputation as a format is fine so long as it really is disputation and not some sort of cliquish mutual congratulation exercise.
No, I like that, and I do think the format is one of the interesting parts that you're going to get feedback on, and that people will find as an entry point within this work. We have another question from a different question from Priyanka. A previous point was made about the future of academia. Do you see the future of academia as texts being more accessible for wider audiences? as in, do we see a day when academic concepts and theories are written in a manner that people with research are actually able to read them, or is that not the goal of academia?
Well, it should be the goal of academia to produce texts that other people can read, but it's absolutely true that that there's a crisis in academic publishing at the moment. A lot of what comes out is appalling. It's very badly written. It lacks any kind of voice of the people who have written it. There's a demand almost by some journals that you don't publish anything that reveals what you feel personally about things. That there's still this myth of academic authority and objectivity, but also a requirement to write in a kind of language that protects the boundaries of the academy. And that's something that I've been trying all the time to resist. I've been trying to find a way of writing. People keep saying it's very poetic. I just say it's good writing. I mean, it's writing that people can actually read. And it's writing that I write with my own voice, with my own hand, not in some kind of a jargon that one is supposed to implement. So I'm hoping that we can find a new way of writing in a scholarly way, which does not continually resurrect this boundary between the academy and the rest of the world. And I mean, the key thing, I think, is that writing should be accessible, but there is a key difference between accessible writing and popular writing. So, for example, Darwin's Origin of Species was a very accessible book. People could read it and understand it, but it was not written as a popular book. It was written to present some really radically new ideas. And I think we could take that as a model of actually how to write well, to communicate your thinking in a way that is rigorous, disciplined, vivid, alive, poetic, but not popular. I mean, popular writing works on the principle of the advertising. If you want to advertise a product, you have a good nose for what people want and then give it a new spin. And there's masses of writing, for example, in popular science that follows that formula, and it's dreadful. We have to avoid that. But I do think that there's a challenge for us all to find much better ways of writing, and to realize that writing is part of the thinking process itself. It's not something we just do afterwards, once we've come up with our results or had our thoughts.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate that answer. I think it's thoughtful, and I think it's that idea of writing as thinking is something that speaks very much to myself. Someone that's done essaying a lot for that very reason, and I think that idea of how we communicate work and our thinking to audiences is very valid. So yes, that's ideal. Gillian, I wonder if you have a final question. I think we're nearing the end of our time.
We are nearing the end, and there's nothing else on the Q&A, so I just thought, I wondered if it would be nice just to finish up by asking the panel, what's next? Are there future collaborations planned, or are you all working on individual projects now?
Well, I'm trying to get back to field work I did in Finland 40 years ago, to write it up properly, because I never have, and I still haven't got there. I've been planning to do this for the last 2 years, and people keep asking me to do other things, and so I'm still trying to get there. But that's where I am. I don't know about Robert, Philip, and Diego.
Well, I'm writing a book about anthropology and translation.
And I'm just in the process of starting some work on fairy tales and storytelling and such, and going back to Tim's writing. So the work on Tim continues.
I'm co-editing a special issue on the anthropology of relation and engaging with Tim's work on it, and chairing a conference in Germany in the next weeks about it, as well as completing a monograph on Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity in Addis Ababa.
Fantastic. All very, very busy then. Tim, can you tell us a bit more about where you've been and what you've been up to?
Just recently, I mean, I'm just back from a 12-day trip to Taiwan and Japan, where I've been to Japan several times, but I've never been to Taiwan before, and it was absolutely amazing. Just the sheer vibrancy of the discussions and the excitement there. So that's something that I was giving talks in contemporary art museums and also in anthropology. Next thing on the list, there's a conference in Oxford on vernacular architecture next weekend, and the next thing on the list after that is this workshop in Bayreuth, which Diego is organizing or co-organizing on questions of generations. And the next thing after that, there's the book I wrote called Anthropology and as Education. It's a title I hate, and now I've had a chance to revise it. So I've revised it quite extensively with a new chapter, and it's going to be coming out under the title Old Ways, New People, with the subtitle Anthropology and as Education. So I've just been dealing with the sub-editor's queries on that. That should be published. I regret to say by Taylor and Francis, around the same print.
Oh dear. Yeah, must do better next time, Tim.
But anyway, that's the next substantial thing, I think, to come out.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much to you all for finding time amongst all of that to join us today. There's a nice comment there just come through in the Q&A to say thanks so much for generously sharing ideas and experiences about getting this work out, which seems a really fitting end.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. So I will do a couple more thank yous if I may, just in our closing minutes. I do want to thank colleagues for facilitating this event, including Gillian, but there are many others behind the scenes as well. And incredible thanks to all of our audience for joining us today, for registering and attending, and asking such attentive questions as well. Our thanks to authors Robert, Philip, and Diego, and to Tim for sharing their insights and their experiences with us today in this conversation. And of course, the book itself that we've been discussing, that we've been chatting about for the last hour, Conversations with Tim Ingold, is available open access from the SUP website. So that's sup.ac.uk. And there's a link in the chat as well that you can find. You can read online. You can download it as a PDF or an EPUB for book readers. You can also purchase a paperback or hardback copy if that's your preference from all normal retailers. And for library colleagues on the call, our standard vendor options all work too. I really have picked up from this chat that we've had, this idea of clarifying thoughts and living our life through conversations. And I really hope that everybody involved today and that's joined us has enjoyed this conversation, and that's given everybody a little bit of room within your day to think about and explore topics that are of interest to you, and that you'll download and share the book and enjoy extending this conversation even further. So thank you, everybody, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.